So this is my Grail watch. There's no question that this is it, and there never will be. The term Grail is used a lot by watch people, and the meaning of it definitely seems to vary. For some, it means a watch that they would like to have, but is just out of their price range. For others, it's a watch that is vintage, rare, and highly coveted. And still for others, it refers to a watch that's impossible to buy, let alone ever seen on anyone else's wrist. It may not even exist. And of course, I have my own interpretation for a Grail watch that's a bit different. For one, I'm lucky to say that I own it, which for some would already disqualify this as a Grail. But let me explain what defines my own Grail watch and why this is it. A forewarning, my thoughts on a Grail watch are formed mostly by my thoughts on the Holy Grail, and those thoughts were formed mostly by Catholic school, Monty Python, and Indiana Jones. Though I can assure you that you don't have to remember that Jehovah starts with an I to get your Grail watch. First off, I believe there can only be one Grail watch for you. I totally understand if that single Grail for you changes in time, but I sometimes hear people refer to their Grail watches in plural, which I personally think just defeats the meaning of it. Imagine how different that movie would have been if the Nazis could just go find the other Holy Grail. Second, though this watch may very well be the most expensive watch I own, I don't believe a Grail watch necessarily has to be expensive or particularly rare. That's totally fine if you feel differently, but for me it would be a bummer if you could never actually attain your Grail. And Lord knows we all don't have the same budget for this crazy watch collection thing. So one man's beater watch could very well be another man's Grail, and that's okay. That said, I do strongly feel that in the traditional sense of a quest for a Holy Grail, there has to be some sort of journey involved with getting your Grail watch. While the term Grail watch has a flexible interpretation, you're probably missing the point of it if you found your Grail watch within a couple months of getting into watches. I think the coolest part about a Grail watch is the personal meaning and stories behind them. In fact, I recommend reading A Man and His Watch if you want to read some great stories. And I really don't read many books at all, so if you're like me, it has great pictures too. I have a story of my own for this one, which I'll get to shortly. But first, let me quickly introduce you to this watch. This is an Omega Speedmaster Professional, model 3578.51, with a manual wind caliber 1861 movement. Introduced in 2003, many things about this watch are similar to a typical Speedmaster of this time, except for on the dial and on the back, well, there's Snoopy. On the surface, this does not check many boxes that define a Grail watch for others. 2003 doesn't exactly say vintage, and while this technically is a limited edition with 5,441 made, that number also really doesn't say limited, if you ask me. But it was definitely tough tracking down a good example of this watch with box and paper still intact. I'll get to why I think that's the case later too. And before you think it must be rare for Snoopy to be on an Omega, there are actually two Omega Speedmaster Snoopies, with the other being introduced in 2015, more limited, twice as expensive on the secondary market, and for many, the preferred one. But this is the one I've always wanted because this version is the first, I guess you can call this the Snoopy 1, and aside from Snoopy, looks exactly like a traditional Omega Speedmaster. If you don't know much about these watches, the next two questions are likely, why the hell is Snoopy on the dial of any Omega watch, and what are you, a little kid or something? First, there actually is a legitimate connection between Snoopy, NASA, and Omega, which I think is the coolest part of this watch's history. In 1968, NASA wanted a way to promote the impact that its employees, not the astronauts, had on these groundbreaking space missions, and they wanted to use a symbol that was well known to the public. Enter Snoopy. The Director of Public Affairs had the idea for the Silver Snoopy Award, a pin featuring Snoopy, as an astronaut of course, that would be given by astronauts to commend the contributions of NASA employees or contractors. Turns out Charles Schultz was an avid supporter of the U.S. space program, so he let NASA use Snoopy as their mascot at no cost, and even drew the image used for the award pin himself. So to be clear, in order to have been awarded a Silver Snoopy, you had to be a NASA employee or contractor and had to make a significant contribution to a mission. That said, I actually managed to get one for myself, but let's talk about that one over a drink sometime, huh? So that still doesn't answer why Omega put a Snoopy on their Speedmaster. Well, it's to commemorate the time when the Speedmaster was actually awarded the Silver Snoopy in 1970. Well, I should say Omega got the award. It would be kind of weird if an object was commended. And there's a good reason why Omega was awarded. I'll spare you the story of why NASA chose Omega to supply Speedmasters to their astronauts, though I suggest you look it up. And fast forward to Tom Hanks, Jim Lovell, on Apollo 13 telling Houston they have a problem. I hope it's not a spoiler for you that NASA finds a way to get the Apollo 13 crew back home. But what you might not know is that a critical part of them getting home involved burning the rocket fuel at a certain point for exactly 14 seconds, with any deviation from this time possibly taking away any chance of them getting back to Earth alive. With their systems not working, they had to rely on the Speedmaster to time the 14 seconds. Pretty cool, huh? But even with that legitimate history around this watch, it still doesn't address if I'm just a big kid. That's 2 Tom Hanks references for everyone that's counting. For my Grail watch being one with Snoopy on it. And the answer is, yes. I'll always be a kid at heart. And I still love Snoopy. Everything about him. And I suspect I'm not the only one. I'm pretty sure that one of the reasons it's so hard to find a Speedmaster Snoopy with box and papers is because the kind of person that buys that watch is also the kind of person that's never going to let that watch go, or probably threw the box and papers away because they at least thought they were never going to sell it. So finding a good example of this watch was definitely one part of the journey, but the other part of it is much more personal to me. And the main reason that this is my Grail watch. I'm the youngest of 3 brothers by 7 years, and my birth mother passed away when I was 9, which means I spent most of my life listening to people and doing what I was told. I'm actually glad about that, but it also means that there were a lot of times that I never quite thought for myself. The fact that September by Earth, Wind & Fire was my favorite song at age 10 is a perfect example of that. That's still my favorite song, by the way. I readily admit that being perhaps too concerned about what other people think carried over to my professional life, my personal life, and even my watch collecting. I've known about this watch for more than 10 years, and I loved it the minute I knew it existed. And back then I could have bought several of these at much lower prices. But back then, I couldn't get over how I thought other people would view me for having Snoopy on my watch, like a kid. So I convinced myself it wasn't something an adult would wear, whatever that means. And I opted for safer, more universally accepted watches. But an interesting thing happened as I got older, moved up professionally, got married, got a dog, had kids, unfortunately lost some friends and family way too young, and had some health issues of my own. I started to care less about what other people thought and cared more about just being myself. And I realized that life was too short to constrain yourself from pursuing things that made you happy. So I went back and searched for the Snoopy, sold some watches that are probably more quote-unquote acceptable, and paid so much more than I would have 10 years ago. But it doesn't matter, because the personal journey I've taken to confidently exclaim that this is the watch I've always wanted was worth it. Which brings me to the final part of why this is my Grail watch. True to the definition of the Holy Grail, this watch gives me life. Every time I look at it, it makes me feel younger, brings me joy, and reminds me to not take anything in life too seriously. It also reminds me, all at once, to live a good life, be a good person, give the best part of myself to my family, and always encourage my children to do what they love to do and give their all to it. In other words, tell them it's okay to keep their eyes on the stars. If you have the time, I'd love to know what your Grail watch is in the comments. And if you don't have the time, I hope it's because you're staring at your own Grail watch.